right. Looks like we are ready to get started here. Gonna give a couple minutes for anybody to come in if they'd like. If not, then you can watch back the VOD. Hopefully enjoy the interesting stuff that we've found. The music or anything is too loud, just let me know. Okay, so I think we're gonna get started here. All right, so with that, we're gonna get started here real quick. Oh no. Here we go. So we are going through the top 10 news stories as written by Colin Hansen, editor over at the Gospel Coalition, an excellent source for all news on theology, Christianity, etc. So he had his top 10 news stories going from 10 to 1. So we're going to follow that, and then I'm going to expand on what he said there with some other interesting things that I found. So starting with number 10. Southern Baptist Convention disfellowships Saddleback Church over female pastors. Now, Rick Warren is the person who's kind of in the news for this. He was kicked out of the church in spite of a lot of the stuff that he's done. So he tried to make up with the Southern Baptist Convention while still convincing them to allow him to ordain women as pastors, and it didn't work. He was rejected by an 88% majority, and so that was his try, I guess, to I don't know. You could argue that he's trying to make progress if you're from a particular camp, or you could say that he's trying to mess up the design of the church. But overall, the Southern Baptist Convention said no, and so he's been kicked out. And this isn't just him. A lot of other churches have been facing the same or a similar question, which is, are we going to allow women into ministry, whether it's ordained ministry, so pastors, elders, senior pastors, that sort of thing. For a lot of churches, they're asking questions even like, can women be deacons, which most people would say is a much lower tier of leadership. And so there's different theological ways people approach this. Typically, it's from either the egalitarian perspective that says that women can do anything in the church that men can do, whereas the more conservative or complementarian view is that there are different roles in the church. And so the Southern Baptist Convention is an evangelical group that is solidly conservative, solidly complementarian, and did away with Rick Warren's push to make it more egalitarian. But they are far from the only group that's asking this question. Even the Orthodox group, the Orthodox Symposium, asked if they could potentially move forward with making women deacons. Now, this is something that isn't actually a crazy idea. Now, the Orthodox tend to be even more conservative than just about anybody else. More conservative probably than the Catholics, the very conservative Catholics. They see themselves as the people who basically have the earliest version of the church. Now, there's a group in the Orthodox Church that's been pushing for the inclusion of women in leadership in the sense that they could act as deacons. Now, what that would look like is reverting in some sense to an ancient practice. Now, we know from a lot of extra biblical sources, or at least some extra biblical sources very early on, that women were deaconesses. In the Bible, we don't have a term for deaconess. We just have deacons, kind of a male gendered word. However, there seems to be indications that women were deacons, even in the time of the Bible. And very early on, women became deaconesses. I forget the exact source, but there is I think it's a letter about a female deacon who was killed by the Romans, and she was noted for refusing to bow down and worship any other god. So extra biblical sources, people who didn't even like Christians, even noted that women had some level of involvement with the church beyond just being lay people. So that's pretty interesting. And now the Orthodox Church is looking to bring that practice back. Now, elsewhere in the Catholic Church, Pope Francis said, "I want you to demasculinize the church," saying that women have a way of reflecting on theology that is different than men. Now, if you're from what do you call it? Denomination that already has women as pastors, this might seem strange to you, but of course the Catholic Church only has male priests. And so, let's see, he said, "There's something I don't like about you, if you excuse my honesty," talking to the theologians who had gathered. "There's only a few women there. We need to move forward. Women have a way of reflecting on theology that is different from us men." Now, overall, he's correct in the sense women reflect on theology differently than men. Whether or not that'll end up being a good or bad thing for the Catholic Church in the long run, I guess history will be the judge. So that's number 10 news story. They push for more and more female inclusion in the leadership of the church, even in the most conservative elements of the church. I'm sorry. Number 9. This is one that I don't have a ton to add to. The pro-life movement regroups after electoral setbacks. Now, the pro-life movement, of course, Roe v. Wade was dismantled by the Supreme Court. Since then, several states have put in protections into law and into their constitution, saying that abortion is a protected right of women, which is a big pushback against what had happened with dismantling Roe v. Wade. And so now the pro-life movement needs to figure out what it's going to do, because they put people on the ballot who are going to put into the Constitution that no one would be able to have an abortion, or put very strong limits on abortion. And what happened is those candidates were defeated. And so the pro-life movement is going to have to come up with a new way forward, or put better candidates forward. Overall, it's been a kind of rough year for pro-life advocates. Excuse me. Number 8. I to flash forward too much there. Timothy Keller dies. And in this section, I wanted to cover not just Tim Keller, but other Christians who have died throughout the year. Because he's far from the only notable Christian figure who's passed away. So I'm going to go through a bunch of other ones and then kind of wrap up with Tim Keller. So first, Pat Robertson. Now, Pat Robertson, incredibly important figure. He's the one who's made CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, what it is today, with his 700 Club and so on. As it says here, he was involved in the Charismatic Renewal, which is huge. Like, the fastest growing denomination right now is the Assemblies of God, a charismatic Pentecostal denomination, Christian TV, and evangelical politics. Christian TV is sort of something we're going to be covering a little bit later, but evangelical politics, of course, is like in the news right now, right? Without him, I think in a very real sense, you don't have anything like Donald Trump. You don't have the Republican Party of today. And because of that, you don't end up having the Democrat Party of today. So Robertson, incredibly important. I wanted to make sure we didn't get him mixed up with the Trinity Broadcasting Network. I didn't actually understand this before I researched it. There's the CBN and there's TBN. Christian Broadcasting Network is much more trustworthy. They used to have, I think it was Jim Bakker on it. He's a prosperity gospel, kind of a scam artist. And he eventually left and went to Trinity Broadcasting Network. And TBN, on the other hand, has had a long partnership with Kenneth Copeland, who is kind of the granddaddy of the prosperity gospel. Anybody who's into that kind of thing ascribes their interest in it to him. And he's somebody who has like private jets. He's got all the money in the world, and he's just this incredibly insane dude. So I want to make sure we don't get this mixed up between the two of them, because they're not at all the same. This is from, I think, ministrywatch.com that tells you whether or not the people or charities you're donating to are trustworthy. And this is what they say about these two groups. Even though the names are similar functions, they're kind of rivals, not the same at all. The next person is Charles Stanley, father of Andy Stanley. Now, Charles Stanley, very important in the Southern Baptist Convention. Even after he ended up having a divorce, he had preached against men who had divorces being in leadership, ended up being influential in the church, which is unusual. As far as we can tell, there weren't any scandals. It's more so that he overemphasized his ministry to the detriment of his family. So he ended up having this whole, it's a really interesting story. He had this whole empire, basically, that he was gonna bring his son up and have his son, Andy, take over. And then there was this big split between the two of them over various things. And so Andy went off and did his own thing, started his own mega church, and Charles continued at his mega church. And eventually they made up before Charles passed away. But yeah, that's another important story for this year. He had at least 13,000 people in his church, which is incredible when you think about it. 13,000 people in weekly attendance. Now, I was looking at some of the numbers from my own denomination, and they've been going through some dips and bumps. And our membership is something like 80,000 total. And you know that when you have membership of 80,000, usually it's about a third of them who attend. So we have about 30,000 people who attend our church nationwide. And so his one church had half the attendance of my entire denomination there. And that really goes to show, I think, the kind of influence that these people have, that their own church can be many times the size of even some fairly old denominations. I guess old here being relative. Mine is 300 years old. That's like a baby compared to someone like the Orthodox. And so a little bit of advice that he'd give to those looking into going into ministry. He said, obey God and leave all the consequences to him. So yeah, if you have a calling from God, you have a conviction from God, follow that to the end. That's the most important thing for you to do, to follow God, follow his word. Leave the consequences to him. Great quote. Now, the next person who passed away, Paul Eshelman. He started the Jesus Film Project, which is a ministry of Cru, formerly known as Campus Crusade or Crusade for Christ, I think. And this movie has been seen millions and millions of times. In fact, here we have a trailer I wanted to show you. Let's see if I can get it to play. There we go. Unfortunately, I don't think you can hear the So anyway, this is the trailer for the Jesus film, highly influential in the world of Christianity. It's a very, as far as I can understand, faithful adaptation of the gospel, straightforward. Pretty much all of the words and so on are taken from the actual text of scripture, which I think is pretty cool. Kind of in contrast to something like the Chosen of today. In fact, they're making this movie into an animated version. I don't know if it'll be the same thing because it looks like it's for kids, and I don't know how you would handle the crucifixion scene with any degree of accuracy, but still do it animated and for kids. So it looks like it'll be another kind of story, but look for that in 2025. It's from the same people who made the original Jesus film. I also wanted to cover the death of Elizabeth Tibb, as Elizabeth Sherrill. She wrote an incredibly important set of books. She was a ghostwriter for a lot of Christian books that many people would be familiar with. The Hiding Place, Cross and the Switchblade. She was well known for those things, helped popularize the charismatic movement. In fact, they started out not having faith, which is kind of interesting. They wrote these Christian books, but it was just for money. And so they had these problems with Jesus and with the message of the gospel. Bring back that music here. There we go. So they had these problems with the gospel, the idea of Jesus as Lord and Savior. And eventually that changed. Her husband, John, was diagnosed with cancer. And so he came to believe that Jesus was God, that he was his Savior. Let's put that back on there. Actually, no. I'm going to take out the chat because I don't think anyone's here. Okay. So he came to believe Jesus as God. And eventually that led to him convincing her. So she became a member of the Episcopal Church, still had problems, right? And that's true of all Christians. They still have problems after they become Christians. But things change. I think for anyone who has faith, you understand that things change once you become a Christian. It's strange to explain, but not all your problems go away. That's not something that's promised in Christianity. But they become, like it says here, the problems become less and become more bearable. And so she eventually went on to write all these other books, talking a lot about the charismatic movement, the power of God's Spirit. They wrote these books about it. They were investigating it in this book that you should check out called They Speak with Other Tongues. And the funny thing is that as they were investigating, they were going to write in this book that was like a journalistic investigation. They themselves were baptized in the Holy Spirit and to speak in tongues. So that's an interesting person to look into, interesting life. Very sad that she passed away. Final person is Timothy Keller. And his call to the American church is for renewal. He's in this article that he wrote fairly recently. He said there is this problem in the American church that needs to be solved. We need to renew the church. here in America. And I think we all understand that there is some deep issue, right? The church is in need of renewal. And so he it basically sets the stage in his article, saying that there's this problem that some people saw of fundamentalism in evangelicalism, that is sticking with the fundamentals of the faith and sometimes being too harsh with other people or exclusive. And so it was believed that young people leaving the church is because of that, so the church needs to become more progressive. Excuse me. However, Keller says that is not the option. The overall project of mainline Protestantism has failed. That's his thesis, that the church cannot continue to be this progressive church. It just will not function in the way that people want it to. It doesn't give people something to live for, really. It tells them the same message that they're hearing all week long, but on a Sunday morning with dressed up in Christian clothing. And so people don't need that. People are going to save their hour or two each Sunday because they're already hearing the progressive gospel. They're already hearing the message of progressivism 6 days a week. Why not hear it 7 days a week, but stay home, you know? Why give money to a church that's going to tell you the same thing you hear everywhere else? So that's his point, is that fails. He was also an incredible apologist, wrote The Reason for God, well respected by almost everybody that I've read. So check out that book as well, The Reason for God. By the end of this, you're going to have a million things to read and catch up on. The seventh news story that's emphasized in this article is the fears of Christian nationalism. Ooh, yes, very, very scary indeed. Some people believe that we are headed for that if we don't stop the election that's coming up. Now, whether or not that's true, I can't really comment, but there is a set of fears around Christian nationalism, especially the new speaker, Mike Johnson. Now, Mike Johnson is known within the Southern Baptist Convention and so on. And so people are hoping that he can actually, instead of making the church or the country more and more extreme, playing to fears one way or the other, but that he can be sort of a middle of the road person. So far as I understand, that's what he has been. That being said, he's not shy about saying what he believes and what he would like to see happen in the highest echelons of the government. And that sort of brings us to an interesting discussion as far as legislating morality. Should Christians do it? is the big question. Some people say, you know, there's the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the world, and never shall the two meet. But on the other hand, people say, we are in this country, have the right to vote, run for office, pass laws. So shouldn't we pass laws that accord with what we believe? And this excellent article by Colin Hanson, Trevin Wax, and Kevin DeYoung, all really well respected voices in the Christian community. I really like this quote. It says, "The real question, therefore, is not whether we should legislate morality, but rather whose morality we should legislate." Because right now, there is no such thing as a morally neutral point of view. And you wouldn't like that anyway. No one would like a morally neutral point of view if it existed. Everyone's arguing from this baseline set of assumptions about what's right and wrong. Whether you're an atheist or a Christian or a Hindu or whatever, whatever law is being passed is legislating morality. So it's not whether or not we can, but that we have to. Like it's impossible to pass a law that doesn't have a moral component to it. And so the question is, how do we pass laws that legislate good morality or proper morality? And of course, that's dependent on the point of view of the person. So when people say, oh, Christians try to legislate morality, the comeback to that is literally everybody tries to legislate morality. And there's no law that exists that's not somebody's morality being legislated. Which I think leads us to an interesting question about whether or not the moral majority, as it's been called, even exists in politics today. It was this coalition, basically, of Christians, especially, who came together to do exactly that: legislate morality. This includes someone we talked about just earlier, Pat Robertson, and others who worked on this, and it worked and then broke apart. It dissipated. And this article that I read from, let's see, I think that this is from Religion News, says even though they work together on similar issues, that's various Christian movements that have kind of splintered off of the moral majority. They continue to function. They're all over there. So the Faith and Freedom Coalition, focused on the family, you've probably heard of them, FRC, and American Family Association. So the moral majority exists in the sense that its impact continues today. It broke apart some time ago, but the people and their legacy lives on to some extent. The next news story that I think is very, very interesting, very fascinating for all kinds of people, whether you're Christian or atheist or some other thing, is high-profile conversions. So we're going to go through several of these. One of them that actually just happened the other day, and look at them. You're going to recognize some of these people, sure. The first one is somebody I had actually never heard of. His name is Daddy Yankee, or at least that's his stage name. Raymond Ayala in Puerto Rico. He's somebody who, in his last show, basically said, "Follow God. My life is His, is Jesus's. I'm gonna make music for His kingdom," which I think is pretty cool, pretty respectable. That being said, for any Christian who's been around following conversions for the last few years, this immediately brings to mind Kanye West, right? Converted to Jesus and then said, "I'm going to follow him," and then he did. He made a couple of gospel albums, but is now seems to be going off the deep end. I'm not going to talk too much more about that. So we'll see what happens here. Obviously, this person is not Kanye West, so I'm sure he'll have his own set of challenges and victories as well. Another person who moved from another religion to Christianity is Ayan Ali. Now, she started out as a Muslim, and then she moved to atheism and hung out with like the new atheist crowd, and now moved to being a Christian. Now, what's interesting is that she doesn't really talk a lot about Jesus in this article she wrote, Why I Am Now a Christian, but rather she says that atheism, as it is, does not allow us to deal with the problems we have today. She says, "Yeah, I would not be truthful if I attributed my embrace of Christianity solely to the realization that atheism is too weak and divisive a doctrine to fortify us against our menacing foes. I have also turned to Christianity because I ultimately found life without any spiritual solace unendurable, and indeed very nearly self-destructive. Atheism failed to answer a simple question: what is the meaning and purpose of life? This is why I no longer consider myself a Muslim apostate, but a lapsed atheist. Of course, I have a great deal to learn about Christianity. I discover a little more at church every Sunday, but I've recognized in my own long journey through a wilderness of fear and self-doubt that there is a better way to manage the challenges of existence than either Islam or unbelief had to offer." So offer up prayers for her as she seeks to learn more about Christianity. I hope that she does come to understand more and more that it isn't just a cultural decision, but something that she truly believes and lives out. The next one is Kat Von D, who's baptized and turned away from witchcraft and the occult. And since she's become a Christian, she started doing what she's calling blacking out. So she's covered in all these tattoos. And to kind of turn over a new leaf, she's been covering them all up with just like this black ink, instead of lasering them off, because that takes a lot of time, several sessions, and there's a lot to do. So instead she's just getting it all covered up. She said she went through her entire library and threw out books that don't align with who she is and who she wants to be, which is amazing to hear. For me, it brings to mind the passage from Acts, chapter 19, verse 19, that it says, a number of those who had practiced magic arts brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. They called the value of them, and it came to 50,000 pieces of silver. So to me, it seems like her change, her conversion, I can't judge it one way or the other, but it seems to be genuine. She's doing the kinds of things that you would expect someone who's been transformed to do, wants to get rid of the old and bring in the new. And she just shared a video of her baptism, which just took place, and professed faith in Jesus Christ and his commands. So that's amazing. Baptized in the triune way. The next conversion that I think is really interesting is Molly Worthen. Now, I read at least a portion of this book. I don't remember how much. Apostles of Reason. And she's obviously the author of it. And so she's somebody who has studied Christianity and evangelicalism in particular for a long time, and eventually came to believe that it's true. And so ended up becoming a Christian. She said, what JD, one of her friends, helped me to see was that it stands or falls on the resurrection. So there's a lot of things in the Bible, right? There's, as she mentions there, the sexual ethic that Christians emphasize, perhaps overemphasize, some people would say. There's heaven and hell, there's angels and demons, right? There's miracles and all of these objections that especially the Enlightenment mind comes up against and says that can't be true. We can't believe in that kind of thing and still call ourselves rational people. And so what JD did, her friend, helped her to see that the main thing in Scripture is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because if he's resurrected, then we have good hope to believe that we will be too. We have good hope to believe that he is who he says he is. That's sort of the key for her that unlocked things. So if you're having questions right now, I would highly encourage you to check out the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The last one is pretty fun. This one was just the other day. Hulk Hogan posted on his Instagram page that he had converted to Christianity as well. There's a video on the Instagram page of him being baptized, and I think that might be his wife, kids. And so now they've all been baptized together. They've dedicated their lives to Christ. He went on the Joe Rogan podcast a little while ago and talked about his church and his desire to follow God. And he's, for years, been somebody who has been willing to talk about his faith. But him being here, getting baptized, and publicly professing it, I think is just another level of commitment. So that's why I'm including him here. So there's a group of people now, from academics to WWE superstars, who are seeking God, who are converting because they're finding that the old ways, whether it was critiquing Christianity or rejecting it in favor of the pleasures of this world, have come around to belief in Christ, believing that this is some better way. So that'll be interesting to track in the new year, 2024, to see what that looks like, whether or not we see a continuing seeking after God in these high profile and low profile conversions. And I hope this is encouragement to anybody watching, that if these people who were set against God in various different ways, if they can be changed, converted, then perhaps you can, perhaps your family can, perhaps your friends can. It should be encouragement to all of us. Of course, this one is a little bit less encouraging. De-churching defies expectation. Now, for the last 60 or 70 years at this point, the trend line of Christianity in America is going down. Down like crazy. I suppose I should be going bad. Going down. And we're going to be looking at that. Why the church is seeming to decline so quickly here in America. Now, first, some definitions. The Great De-churching from the Gospel Coalition is that there are less adults now going to church than ever, right? There are less church adults going to church than go to church, which is unique in American history. There's millions of people who stopped going to church and just never came back. That being said, while that trend line is not good, if you're a business, right, no one would invest in that business except for speculators. I think there are still good bones, right? If we're talking about this as a stock market evaluation, the business has good fundamentals. So a lot of the people who have left, so 51% of de-churched evangelicals said they would be willing or very willing to go back to church if somebody invited them. So the key to fixing this problem is going to be church members who continue to go to church, finding those who don't, and seeking them. That's the first part. Second part is going to be those who never went to church in the first place, evangelizing them. So it's going to be getting people who sort of de-church, bringing them back in, and people who have never been church and bringing them in as well. And of course, like that seems obvious, but the hope is that that 51% who say they're willing and very willing to return, those are the first people to go for. They're kind of the low-hanging fruit, and then go from there. The other piece of hope that I see is that while there are problems at the church, giving is up. And I don't want to sound like somebody who's just all about money, right? I'm not prosperity gospel at all. But in a conversation I had with one of my pastor friends, he experienced this firsthand. They're a medium-sized evangelical Christian non-denominational church. He said that a bunch of people left from COVID because they thought he was being too political or not political enough. So you can't ever please everybody. And people left. The church shrunk, but giving went up. A bunch of people then joined the church, a lot of young families. And because of this, they've had to open a preschool at the church to educate these young kids. And so the church is actually in a better state than it's ever been. It has more young people coming in, has more money coming in. It's in a healthier place demographically, in a healthier place financially, and so on. So this is an interesting thing to watch, that as in some sense the church has declined, it's actually gotten better, at least recently. The fourth news story that I think is very personally important, Gen Z. They show signs of spiritual revival. Now, this image here in the back is from the Asbury revival. There are various studies out that have talked about Gen Z being more spiritual than previous generations, more spiritual than Gen X, than millennials, and so on. But they are less religious. What happened at Asbury, very interesting thing. So it started, it's this tiny little town, tiny little school. It's a Christian school, university. And there was a worship set, basically. And there was a call to confession, a call to prayer, a call to seek God in the message. And so a few students stayed there, and they just kept praying, kept worshiping. And then other students saw them and joined them. And then it stayed overnight. And then the service just continued into the next day, with some people picking up instruments and playing music, some people standing up to preach. And it started to gain steam and gain steam and gain steam until the entire auditorium packed out, including the main one, the second one, and so on. The whole town, which has like 2 stoplights, was jam-packed with people seeking an encounter with God because they heard this was happening at Asbury. And it started with Gen Z. The interesting thing about this revival is that it is the first one in the social media age. So it was documented primarily on smartphone cameras and shared that way. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, as this, I think, could cause a sort of domino effect amongst Gen Z, that they seek God. They want to seek an encounter with God, just like the students at Asbury. So that's something that we should watch to see how it turns out. That being said, there are a bunch of Americans, and I think this, like, if we go for de-church people first, this is the second set of people to go for. The 22% of Americans who identify as spiritual but not religious. This is mostly younger Americans. So that's what the church needs to survive, right? We can't just have old people. I love old people, but the church passes away. And if the church doesn't bring in younger people, then it's over. That's true of any organization. And so the spiritual but not religious, finding ways to reach out to them, whether it's offering them a more durable version of spirituality, poking holes in problems that exist with homemade spirituality or anything else. That's going to be key for any church that seeks to grow over the course of the next year or 2 or 10. This is just a comparison chart about spirituality. So millennials tend to be much less spiritually aware than Gen Z, which is interesting. The prediction was that that spirituality, I guess, amongst generations would kind of follow the Great Decline graph. And that was kind of the hope of atheism, that as we moved into the Enlightenment age, that these sort of myths and superstitions would go away. However, we're finding that that is not true with the newest generations, but for, I'm sure, a variety of different reasons. So that gives some hope to the church, which I think is important. The third news story, 7th, depending on how you want to see it. Yeah. Anyway, number 3, activists seek to change theology of sexuality from within Christian communities. So this overlaps a little bit with what we talked about earlier as far as women in leadership. A lot of times the camps that are in favor of that tend to be allied with this camp. And really, it looks like this. It is those who are pushing for, we'll call it radical inclusion in the church. That is saying that transgender or openly gay members of the church can be in the highest echelons of leadership, pastors, elders, etc. That's what they're pushing for. And that has caused all sorts of issues, right? Because that goes against some of the very clearest teachings in the Bible. And so that's caused massive splits within the church. So a quarter of United Methodist churches in the US have left during the split. That's something like 7,600 churches have left because of this rather radical push. Whether you want to call it for inclusion or something else, it's caused a massive problem in the largest denominations in the church. And I think it's that the Southern Baptist Convention wanted to avoid when they pushed back against Rick Warren's push for women in leadership, because it's seen as the sort of first step towards this. And so that happened, a long time ago with Methodists, and now anything goes. Basically, anybody can be a pastor at the church, and that has caused a huge split. Within just this year, 5,600 congregations left. It's incredible. It's something to watch out for. And this is sort of a graph of their membership. So it's not just tiny one-person churches leaving. This is huge numbers of the Methodists leaving. They are currently at the same level of membership that they had back in the 1830s. Okay, so they've been set back 200 years by this division, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon. So that's something to watch out for, because it's a warning sign, honestly, to any denomination that's seeking to do the same thing. And my denomination, like I've said, is tiny compared to these, but we've gone through the exact same thing. So the Church of the Brethren, they say they're trying to continue the work of Jesus peacefully, simply, and together. Great tagline. They just changed it to something else. However, the church is dividing. They're no longer simple, peaceful, or together. This started back in 2020, but it's continued through this year. So that's why I'm including it here in this kind of year in review. Our church as well has done the same thing. So here's a graph of what an evangelical church looks like and what the mainline church looks like. And this was from a book written back in 2014, so it's not quite as up to date. But you can clearly see the difference between the mainline church and the evangelical Protestant church. Now, my church, unfortunately, almost exactly mirrors that kind of decline that happened with the mainline Protestant churches. And this is a big problem for any church that wants to be relevant in 2024 or 2050 or 2070 or beyond, because it's not just old people leaving. It is, but it's also the youngest, most dedicated members of your church who are leaving. It'll be interesting to see what happens, because it turns out that the most progressive elements of all these churches aren't the ones they're going for. They're pushing for inclusion and diversity and so on, but it's actually the diverse members of the church who are pushing back against this. So in our church, we are mostly white, but we also have this interesting growing contingent of Hispanic churches. They're our youngest churches, fastest growing, and so on. And what they did is they sat down with the leadership of our church and said, hey, you can be progressive or you can be diverse, but you can't be both. And if you are progressive, we're going to leave. And so that's kind of the ultimatum they gave to our church, is that, hey, we've seen what you're doing, because our church is, for all intents and purposes, mainline, and we're moving more and more that direction, becoming more and more progressive. And many of you watching probably are from mainline churches or are familiar with what's going on there. And people aren't going to sit around and just let their church walk away from the authority of Scripture, from what Scripture teaches very clearly as far as leadership and sexuality and gender and so on goes. So whether or not you agree with it, the health of the church is at stake, not just your personal opinions on theology. One of my professors from seminary said that mainline churches tend to change theology to match whatever people want, but keep the liturgy or traditions the same. Whereas evangelicals tend to change the liturgy and setup and traditions and so on as much as people want, but they'll keep the theology for the most part the same. And we really see the outcome of those two approaches to doing church here. Of course, this isn't perfect, right? They've had a decline over time, but I do think that it's much better than it might be otherwise. And it's not just my church, not just the Methodists, but the Global Fellowship of Anglican Churches. They are the split-off group from the Anglican Fellowship. They don't recognize the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury. They said, let's see here. They said, we are the Anglican Communion. We're not leaving it. We are the Anglican Communion. What's interesting is that most Anglicans are actually African. They're actually that diversity that these white progressives are looking for, and they are saying we can't go along with this. They represent 85% of all church-going Anglicans. This is incredible. I would honestly say that it's an incredible display of racism to treat the Global South churches as if they're not able to do theology on the same level, white churches. But whether you want to call it colonialism, whether you want to call it something else, it seems like our churches here have been wanting to just dominate these Anglican churches for nothing. Let's see what's going on with the Pope, looking very evil, right? Very, very sinister in this image here. He's opened up all of this debate on hot button issues. It seems like every other day you see something that the Pope says on the issue of sexuality. Just earlier, I read that he's allowing priests to bless same-sex people, but not necessarily same-sex unions. So it's not going to be like an alternative marriage service, and he doesn't want people to see that, but that's not what the headlines say. So he's opened up all of these problems. He's mostly favored progressives. He's been very much into like saving the planet. He's caused these problems caused division in his own church, because there's this big contingent of conservative Catholics, and he's this progressive pope, and he's pushing for all this change in the church. Whether or not you agree with him or not, that's causing these splits. And so he's trying to, I think, giving him the benefit of the doubt, trying to be even-handed. So on the one hand, he kicked out Joseph Strickland from Texas. He's also gotten rid of Raymond Burke at the Vatican. So he's kind of cracking down on people who really criticize the Pope within Catholicism. At the same time, in Germany, which tends to be pretty progressive as far as Catholicism goes, saying that they can't change the basic teachings of the Catholic Church as far as priesthood and sexuality. So we'll see what becomes of that. Second biggest news story is that ChatGPT and other AI, there's a bunch of them now, right? They thrill and threaten tech futurists. These are a couple of AI images that it generated. One, I asked for a robot priest, and then one for a robot preacher, I think in the likeness of Billy Graham. So maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. But AI has been huge. I've used it myself for a lot of different things. And there have been these services done in AI, including in Texas. Interestingly enough, we just mentioned it. Austin, Texas, had a full AI generated service using ChatGPT. And you probably won't be able to hear this video, but I'm going to load it up a little bit so that you can see. So they generated an order of worship with ChatGPT, and it wrote everything. Let's see if I can. ChatGPT wrote a song, created some artwork that they used in the service right there. So AI is now making its way into church. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily bad thing. I don't think it should be used to write a sermon or run a service. That's at the same time, it can be used, I think, for research purposes or for things like that. So it'll be interesting to see what becomes of that. It was also used in a church service in Germany. Now, this one was a lot more uncanny. This was before the church, before it was very good. The AI was very good. So that's an AI that was an AI avatar there, preaching a sermon that AI wrote and projected up onto the screen. So people who were there said it was kind of weird. It wasn't a very personal message. Didn't feel very personal. So at this point, I think that there's only one really acceptable response. Oh no. Well, I guess we won't see it. It was a video of the Space Marines destroying something. So we'll be watching for what becomes of ChatGPT as far as theology and practice goes. The big news story as far as the Gospel Coalition goes is the Hamas attack on Israeli military and civilians, and receiving unexpected support. And I mean, you can see that, right? You can go to Instagram and there will be random people who say, free Palestine, support Hamas, that kind of thing. And I also wanted to bring in the continuing war in Ukraine, because I think there's some interesting theological aspects to that as well. But we'll start with Israel and Hamas. Now, I don't want to bring up maybe an aspect of it that isn't as covered by the mainstream media, because a lot of people will talk about Israel and what's going on there, and Hamas and Gaza and so on. But I want to talk about the Christian population there, which is tiny. It's only about 1,000 people, which is a tiny excuse me, only about 1,000 people, which is a tiny percentage of the people who live in the Gaza Strip. And they are persecuted by their Islamic neighbors. There's like 2 churches there, including members of a member of parliament's. They are trapped in this church in Gaza. So there's an Orthodox church and a Catholic church, and they're right next to each other. And one of the churches was hit by a bomb from Israel, and a lot of people died. This is from NPR. So Palestinian Christians at the Orthodox church, they felt they had nowhere to go, right? They're this tiny group of Christians. If they go further south in Gaza, if they try to leave, they're just entering a group of people who would like to see them dead. And if they stay there, then they have to deal with airstrikes. So they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, literally. And eventually, one of the airstrikes hit, caused a lot of damage. And they're not the only Christians there in the Middle East, or even in Israel itself, who are dealing with things. So the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem. So there's the Muslim quarter, Christian quarter, Armenian quarter, and Jewish quarter. The Armenian Christians, there was a sketchy deal that was done to try to sell their quarter of Jerusalem, which is kind of insane. There was this secret deal done in 2021 to lease it for 99 years and build this big thing on their quarter. And there was all this backlash against it. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the coming months and years. Let's move over to Ukraine and Russia, because they're both allegedly this Orthodox hub group. So on the one side, you had the leader of the Orthodox Church, Epiphanes, the first of Ukraine, sometimes just called Epiphany, and Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, or some people will say that as Cyril. That's where that comes from. So it used to be that Moscow was in charge of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Then they broke off in 2019, and they're autocephalous. They're separate from the Moscow Church. Of course, with the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, there were further breaks. So Epiphany said to Cyril, "The lives of Russian soldiers has become the price for your ideas and those of your president." So Cyril has been buddy-buddy with Putin for a long time. And so he was all in favor of this sort of invasion of Ukraine. And so Epiphany has kind of been striking back. And Ukraine has put this guy's head on their docket. They said that they might ban the branch of the Moscow church, and it's severed all links with Moscow, and this guy is now on Ukraine's most wanted, which I think is kind of interesting, kind of funny. So that's all we have for the big news stories, the top 10 news stories from the Gospel Coalition. But I want to cover a few other ones that I think are worth mentioning from this past year. But the first one is the canonization of a Native American, which I believe would be the first Native American saint in the Catholic Church, or confirmed saint. So Nicholas Black Elk. There was a article that was written that said he was not actually a Christian, not actually Catholic, but his family said whoever said that didn't know him, which is great to hear. So I'm gonna follow this story, and I hope that it goes through. So he's a servant of God, recognized that way, and his canonization is now before the people in charge of that at the Vatican. So that's a cool, feel-good story. I hope that that all works out. The next one is The Chosen. Now, The Chosen, incredibly popular TV series. So here is a chart of how much it's been seen as of August 2023, just on Prime. So this isn't everywhere. This is just Prime, and they're actually being watched at that time more than The Boys, less than Jack Ryan, less than Good Omens, and a whole lot less than The Summer I Turned Pretty, but still an impressive showing for a fairly niche show. they've also come out with a Christmas special, which you can watch, or will be able to watch here soon. It was in theaters. Yeah, so it's a combination of two previous Christmas specials brought together. And so that'll be available to watch or stream by Christmas because it's now out of theaters. That's what they said on Facebook. In the app, on time for Christmas. So make sure you get the app if you want to watch that. Now, this show's been incredibly popular, viewed at least 312 million times, and that was back in 2021. So it'll be interesting to see how this show continues to perform as it goes into season 4 here in 2024. So keep your eye on that. Another important, cool news story that I want to wrap up with here is the rebuilding of Notre Dame. So it's going to be 1 year until the cathedral reopens to the public after a massive fire. So mark your calendar for December 8th, 2024. There will be a billion news stories about that. But the rebuilding seems to be going along quickly. So that's a real blessing, really awesome thing to hear. And that's all I have for you today. Come back next week. We're going to be covering various news stories in Christianity, in culture, all the biggest stories. So come back and we'll cover those. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in a comment under this video and I'll do my best to answer them.